welcome to this webinar on a Friday afternoon. Who organizes webinars on a Friday afternoon? Clearly I do. Today we're going to be talking managing Africa's reputation, and this is a prelude to a bumper Africa Travel Week conference program, which you'll be able to access on the sidelines of Africa Travel Week Virtual, which is happening in just a few weeks' time. If you work with tourism in Africa, and certainly South Africa, you're probably feeling like me right now, angry and frustrated every time I see a politician or member of the press talk about mutant variants, most notably 501YV2, call it by its name, or as they like to refer to it, the South African variant. So this has huge implications for South Africa, but not just for South Africa, for Africa, from a destination reputation perspective. And it's probably one of the biggest things on your radar right now. I know it's certainly on mine. So today's webinar is going to focus on the destination reputation of Africa. We're going to look at how African countries are handling the pandemic and the impact of the vaccine rollout in international media on the continent's travel and tourism sector. We'll also get to grips with understanding this so-called SA variant. And again, let's call it by its name, 501YV2. It's not difficult to remember. And ways that destinations and tourism product can negate some of the negative reporting that we are seeing internationally to ensure that our tourism recovery happens sooner rather than later. So to help me do this, I'm so thrilled to have some of my favorite panelists in the room with me today. I've actually been looking forward to seeing them, believe it or not, for a couple of days now. And I'd like to welcome them now in alphabetical order. So Professor van den Heever, Alex van den Heever, who's the Chair of Social Security Systems Administration and Management Studies from the University of Witwatersrand. Prof has been with us on many webinars and we're very appreciative of his time. We also have Anita Mendurata from Anita Mendurata and Associates, who's currently in Cape Town, but is actually based in London. We have Monica Yule, who's the CMO of Wesgrow, Tim Henschel, who's the Chief Executive of Tim. I'm not sure how to pronounce this. Is it Camagio? Thumbs up if I'm right.
I don't care what you call me as long as you call me.
I'm calling you. And then Chifiwa Chivengwa, CEO of the Tourism Business Council, and also recently the recipient of amazing Skull notoriety. So well done on your award, Chief. It's well deserved. Of course, your voice is also very important to us, and we would love to get your questions and also to hear from you in the chat. It's very different. Chat is where you converse with each other. The Q&A is where I would like you to put all your questions, please, because I anticipate we will get a lot of questions and it will make it easier for me to facilitate. So chat is open. Please let us know where you're connecting from. We'd love to hear from you. And the Q&A folder is open for your questions. Right, I'm going to kick off with Alex to set the scene for us. Alex, this morning, BBC report, third waves, vaccine delays, scary mutant variants. I got very cross. Is it as bad as the press and the politicians overseas would have us believe? Please give us the truth, warts and all. We need to hear it.
So South Africa remains vulnerable to a third wave, and I think we do have to accept that as a reality. But there are a number of factors to take into account in evaluating what's likely to happen. One of which is the degree to which or the number of people who've already been infected in South Africa, which means that there is an accumulating level of immunity. And there is some indication that a lot more people have been infected than the reported statistics, and certain provinces have been a lot more affected than other provinces. So we will probably only see this play out in the next couple of months, particularly as we go into winter. What is clear is that the second wave, which wasn't totally expected in South Africa, was largely driven by super spreading events. And therefore, human behavior is quite critical in whether or not you have a second wave or a third wave. And therefore, but what was interesting in the restrictions that were introduced in December, it did appear as though they effectively targeted the super spreading. And you had a dramatic reduction in infections in all 9 provinces at roughly the same time, suggesting that the interventions were, the downward trajectory was related to the interventions. This is not what we saw in the first wave. So I think those are some issues to take into account. I think that one has to maintain a general level of concern if you still have a large residual uninfected population. So even with the relatively high estimates, and a number of us are working back from the excess death information to try and estimate the number of people who've actually been infected, and it's not trivial at all. It's a significant number, way above 1.5 million. Probably of the order of something like 12 to sort of 20 million that could have been infected. And if that's the case, we may see the third and the fourth wave slowly starting to get less and less severe. But again, there's uncertainty about how we estimate the infection levels. And so we can't be totally sure. So we kind of have to see how things work out, but it remains a risk, and certain provinces have still relatively high residual susceptible populations, which means that they are vulnerable to further waves. Gauteng is, Western Cape as well, and KwaZulu-Natal to a lesser extent, because they had a very severe second wave. And Eastern Cape had a dramatic second wave. And therefore, the estimates suggest that there's been a huge number of infections in the Eastern Cape, which could suggest that they will have reduced waves subsequently. But that's kind of the picture. Places like Limpopo, still very, very high residual susceptible population, and therefore you could have more severe waves in places like that.
From the reporting that I'm seeing, and certainly the conversations that I'm having, I'll stick with you, Alex. We have destinations that have banned South Africans from traveling because of the 501(y)(v)(2. And there's this idea that the vaccination rollout is the Hail Mary, and it's actually nothing is going to work. Third wave, whether or not there are third waves, unless we have a vaccination program in South Africa that is rolled out robustly. Can you give us an idea of where we are at with that vaccination program?
Yeah, so we have been very critical of government's vaccination program and strategy. But I do expect that we're going to have a number of announcements quite soon. So despite the fact I've been very vociferous in saying government has basically massively dropped the ball, that is very much part of getting government to get its act together and move. They clearly didn't get their act together in 2020. They didn't have bilateral contracts. They did not have a proper rollout strategy or ground game developed. The current vaccinations that we have now of Johnson & Johnson are a workaround based on an expansion of a phase 3 trial for Johnson & Johnson in South Africa. What is valuable is that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has been shown to be quite effective against the South African variant. And sorry to use it as the South African variant, but it is actually quite effective. And that's important, because now the question becomes, are we going to be able to access Johnson & Johnson doses for the remainder of our government rollout? Because this is really just a trial. These are people running clinical trials. They are not government. That's what we've got at the moment. So we've got, say, 200,000 people vaccinated, frontline health workers, which is very good. But it's nowhere near to what we need. At the current rate of vaccination, which isn't our government rollout, it would take 17 years to vaccinate to herd immunity. But it's quite clear that there are behind the scenes negotiations to access around about 11 million doses of Johnson & Johnson. Johnson & Johnson's a single shot dose, which means that we do not have to vaccinate people twice to get immunity. It was effective in the South African context. But the question really is what the timing is of the 11 million doses. And I doubt that it's going to all be at once. We will also have contracts signed for Pfizer. And then there's still COVAX, which is uncertain for South Africa, because a lot of the COVAX program was dependent on the AstraZeneca vaccine, which South Africa has implicitly rejected. We didn't roll out with the 1 million doses of AstraZeneca that we had. And quite a lot of people, including myself, and we published it on the South African Medical Journal, have said that was a mistake. We should have rolled out with AstraZeneca regardless, because there is a very strong possibility that it provides immunity against severe illness, even if it doesn't prevent transmission. So that's the issue there. So if you would have seen in News 24 today, there are holdups on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine rollout because South Africa hasn't set up the no-fault regime for the vaccines yet. And I think that the whole contractual arrangement isn't being finalized until that kind of indemnity arrangement is in place for the vaccine companies. So, but I think it's all going to happen relatively soon, but I don't expect, but what has been made clear is that our phase 3 will only begin in November and run to March. But basically the intention is to vaccinate the phase 1s and phase 2 in 2021. And I think that that is feasible. I think that they will probably achieve that target. It depends very much on whether they get their act together now and begin moving in April. But essentially, they've got a lot of work to do in April.
Anita, I see you've unmuted yourself. Did you want to weigh in?
I would be very grateful. And I'm going to now jump to my UNWTO capacity as special advisor to the Secretary General. I think what Alex has said is really important. And the reason why I wanted to jump in is that we always need to keep this in perspective. The future of the world is not dependent on the vaccines. And Alex said something really, really important right at the beginning in the fact that I'm a firm believer wave 1 was because of Mother Nature. She caught us all out, there's no question. Waves 2, 3, and 4, and anything after that are a result of human misbehavior. And you spoke about, Alex, the spreader events, whatever it might be. There's been a lot of the contagion going around because of the fact that the protocols have not been respected. The vaccine does not prevent, the vaccine does not cure. The vaccine is there very much to contain and control the impact. But what our world has never faced before is a completely democratic, completely effectively universal, invisible crisis. This is not like terrorism where you see it. It's not like a water crisis where the dams are dry or an economic downturn. And no government in the world institutionalizes an economic collapse by shutting down borders. What I have found is that, as mentioned before we came on live, I'm leaving next Friday to go back to the UK. I go straight into 10 days of hotel quarantine at Heathrow at the cost of £1,750 to me, because the UK has been effectively in a lockdown at different levels since a week after I left in December. They've had the last 4 months contained. The freedoms we have here in South Africa, even though we are facing still the pandemic, are remarkable. And it's interesting how psychologically, me getting now ready to go back to the UK, I'm having to recognize I can't walk outside the door. I can't go to a restaurant at the V&A. It's not about being sanitized at every doorway and wearing my mask anymore. My life will be constricted. So the frustration that we feel here is completely understandable in terms of the lives, livelihoods, and liberties that we've lost. But I think the relativity of the quality of life we have despite the pandemic is really important to keep in mind. And that ultimately it is the vaccines that are going to get people confident about traveling. That will get the aviation back in the air. That will open up the borders. That will bring the travelers back. The point about the vaccine name itself, that's the critical issue, is the reputational management. And the fact that we do indeed have a vaccine referred to, ironically, the country that had the scientific expertise to identify the strain in the first place. We know that COVID-19, which was incorrectly called the coronavirus at the beginning, similarly, the flu is coronavirus, SARS is coronavirus, MERS is, it's the family. So exactly as you say, Natalia, it's about recognizing there's a name for it. We do need to call it by its name. Fine, it was the strain that was first identified in South Africa, but the narrative around explaining origin vis-a-vis the actual source of identification are two very different things. I just wanted to put that into perspective because before this is an economic crisis, before this is a travel and tourism crisis, this is a global healthcare and humanitarian crisis. And governments are doing based on what they know best. No one was prepared for this. No one knew what was coming and everyone's trying to figure it out. But I get concerned when so much focus is on the vaccine as the messiah. That is not the case. And exactly as you've identified correctly, Natalia, other countries are going to start identifying other strains. We need to, as a global effort, stay close to healthcare, get the right articulation, get the right nomenclature, take the flags off where the strains were identified, but recognizing this is not just a South African problem. It's currently UK, Brazil, Russia's going into the same space. So it's a shift to the solution and shifting to the future of unlocking countries, not depending purely on the vaccines, but looking at this at a much more collective solution-based level.
The UK was smart though, Anita. The UK called it the Kent variant. So I feel really sorry for people who live in Kent. But they were very clever about we should say it's the Durban variant. Hey, Alex. Anyway,
well,
Alex, just a last question before I hop on over to some of the other panelists, and that is around travel bans. So as Anita was talking about putting a travel ban in place, and you know, we did, yes, Joel, don't worry, I won't. And we, in December, obviously went into some form of lockdown, and that to a certain extent was effective. But as we've had a conversation about before, it's a bit of a blunt instrument. Do the travel bans actually work?
So first of all, it's important to look at what configuration of interventions we used in December, because they were a lot less restrictive than earlier. Restaurants remained open, for instance. There was an alcohol ban and there's a curfew. And there was a prohibition on certain kinds of nightclubs, for instance. And effectively the alcohol ban shut down pubs and shebeens, for instance. But everything else was still largely open. Shopping centers were open, pharmacies were open, businesses remained open. And yet we had a very swift decline in transmission in South Africa. So we're currently at the levels now that we were at from the end of the first phase right up until toward the end in mid of November. So we achieved that while still actually continuing to operate. So hotels were still open. People were still moving around. Now, despite that, those clearly were not drivers of super spreading. And I think that's important to note, is that it is actually possible to understand the risks associated with an airborne sort of pathogen like this, manage those risks effectively, and keep the risks low. If there's a surge that's beginning, the question is, what's the configuration of limited restrictions that will keep it low? So I think that travel bans and things like that tend to be overkill, because those are not super spreading events. Those are just seeding events. Somebody infected here moved to somewhere else. Now that will be the case where people start to become scared of a particular variant that's emerged, and there are going to be hundreds of variants. So right now, because it became a very sort of topical issue, people start to think that they can manage that the way they try to manage the original virus, which is to close borders. The reality is the variants are going to be in every country at some point. You're not really going to shut it down. So what we are looking at is a scenario pretty much like flu down the line, is that we will probably end up through vaccination, through natural infection, progressively developing a degree of immunity, which might not stop infections totally, but will certainly stop severe illness and death. And probably you end up maybe in a few years with the equivalent of having to vaccinate high-risk groups as you do for flu. So as you get the flu shot, you might get a shot for people there just to boost their immune system against the latest variants that have been identified. And that will probably be the world we move into down the line. So it will not be the current emergency, but every vaccine we take, and every time somebody gets infected, they are building up important levels of immunity. And the immune system is extremely complex itself, and it requires somebody other than me to go through all the elements of it. But we are building up immunity over time that will change the scenario we're facing. So I think vaccines and prevention remain important. Vaccines mean that you build up immunity without having to go through the risk of severe illness, which is why it's really important to begin the phases with the high-risk groups and the people at risk of very high doses of infection, such as healthcare workers and people in high-risk settings where they can't avoid very high doses of the virus being let's say confronted with it. So so I think that and dosage is important. If you get a very, very small dose, your body could probably fight it off. But if you get a very large dose, you're in a different realm. So I think that that's the world we're in. And the issue is really, I think that what is useful to note from this particular pandemic is that we were vulnerable to this kind of pandemic no matter what. It was going to happen. We were going to go through this threshold where we will get an airborne pathogen which is more deadly than we've experienced before. And therefore we would have to react to it. And it's potentially going to happen again. So what we do start to put in place now as prevention methods and methods of protecting ourselves from airborne transmission, which is what will spread so fast. If it was spread from human to human contact or from surfaces, it would spread a lot more slowly. So this is the biggest risk the travel industry, the hospitality industry would ever face. And I think that what we've seen in the second wave is that South Africa actually managed it because we did not shut down the hospitality industry as a risk mitigation method, and yet we killed transmission.
We managed it, Alex, but we see in the international media that that's not the reputation that South Africa has. South Africa's reputation is around this variant. It's not that South Africa has managed it correctly. And I want to just hand over to Chief now, if I may, if you just unmute yourself, Chief. Speaking to all of the industry players that you do, the impact that this particular story that has gone around the world, and in 1 week there were 14,000 mentions of the South African variant a couple of weeks ago. You can't close the door once the horse is bolted. So tell me a little bit about the feedback that you're getting from the industry in terms of the damage that it has done from a reputational perspective on the destination, and what measures we can take to try and mitigate that.
Well, thank you for having me. I think the first thing that we have to address is an issue of how we as South African, across the government departments, lack coordination in terms of sending out the right message to the world. And I think that's what has caused this, chaos and damage the brand that we have. And subsequently, of course, it's going to have a damage in tourism, over a long period of time. So it comes with how we communicate from the Department of Health to the, government communication agencies, to South African Tourism, to Brand SA, to DTIC. How can we, all of us, communicate with one voice and make sure that there is a whole of government approach in communication? That's what we're lacking, because the scientists wants to talk about this in their own way, without perhaps understanding, from the economic side of things, the way we understand it. And we have seen this with the whole, as soon as we sequence this virus, we ran into the media to say we found something. And we call it the South African variant, and our own media follow through and call it the South African variant instead of calling it what it is. What we should have done instead is to demonstrate, the capabilities that we have to sequence the virus, as a country in Africa. The fact that we have medical experts, the fact that, we've got scientists in the country, and the fact that, we've got equipment to deal with this situation. So we ran into the discovery, mode to say that this is what we found, this is our thing, without looking at how it's gonna have an impact economically, from that point of view. So communication is key, and we do lack in that, from government point of view. In the private sector space, we then picked it up, and because we understand, how this will impact, down the line on tourism, on investments, and so forth and so on. And we said, well, we need to manage the narrative, to ensure that, this has changed. That has not been easy. It's still an ongoing process, because as we've been talking, there's still going to be many variants we're still going to have many crises. But how do we communicate during the time of crisis? It's key. And that's something that, we have not done right, in terms of, this pandemic. We've always had, information coming from different angles and communicated differently. So it is something that, at the moment is being looked at through the NEBLAC processes. There's a communicators team, but we haven't gotten to a point where we can say we have agreed on how we're going to communicate going forward and how we're going to defend the brand going forward. All we need to do is to tell the truth. Let's tell what it is, what we have found, and how we're dealing with it. If you look at the story of how we've managed to have so many things open and use the non-pharmaceutical interventions to get the numbers as low as they are, as much as there could be arguments as to whether the numbers are truly what they are. We do know that it depends on the testing, and we could have many more positive cases out there, and that's acknowledged. But the communication, to really say we've done well as South Africans in terms of the pharmaceutical interventions, and we need to continue to do well. And the fact that vaccine is not cure, we have not communicated those things properly. We still struggle with communication now. We have Easter coming. There has been modeling that have been done in terms of should we allow Easter to go on the way it is and people not complying. This is the quantum of people that may be affected and that may die. But we're still not communicating that information through to the public. So there is an element of politicization of the communication part in terms of how it must be done, by whom, and so forth and so on. But I think that there is an opportunity for us to tell our own story in the way we understand it, in a way that it will show the world that we indeed have put a great deal of efforts in combating this pandemic. We all know that in the past, last year this time around, or some months after, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people that were going to die. Well, we have the numbers that we have, although one can argue that it could be double the numbers, but we've done better, we've fared better, but we're not communicating that message. So communication is key, throughout government. One hand must know what the other one is doing. We still are disjointed from that point of view. Until we get it right and we understand that communication and brand management is key for other parts of the economy, then we will understand that the issues of health do have an impact on economics, and the issues of communications are critical in terms of brand management and what is it that it means when we manage the brand. So again, long way to go. A lot of effort have been made, but we are still lacking in communicating what we need to communicate in a better way that will position us better than where we are today.
I think that's why I'm in disbelief all the time when I see these reports, because I actually do believe that we have done pretty well. If I look at how the source markets are that have banned us are doing currently, and to be kind of scapegoated in the way that we are, we can't obviously have a victim mentality, but I think we are falling short from a communications perspective. I note that both Tim and Alex have unmuted themselves, and I will go to both of you. And afterwards, I'd like to ask Monica to weigh in, because I know that you and I have been working a lot around the communications piece, and I would like your feedback on what Chief has just said. Tim, I'm going to start with you, and then Alex, if you could go ahead.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm no scientist, and I have to say that QR, I think the things that you said in there were the absolutely spot on, and the communications part of it has been sadly lacking, and that's no criticism of South Africa. I think that's a general criticism of the entire pandemic in terms of the communication has way too often been at a scientific level. And as a marketeer, I deal with perceptions as opposed to reality. And the perceptions of South Africa, the perceptions of Africa, specifically to someone in the UK, is it's not a safe place to be from a health point of view. And so that's a deep-rooted perception. There's no recognition of the high standards of the health service that's available in South Africa. And you know, everywhere, the whole of Africa is judged by the lowest standard, not by the highest standard. And so there was expectations here. I remember when the pandemic really started to take hold in Europe, the expectation and the concern was, especially from those involved in African tourism, was, oh my goodness, when this hits Africa, it could wipe out the entire continent. And again, this is about perceptions of man in the street. But the expectation is that this would decimate Africa. And then we come on to another misconception. And I think both Anita and Alex very eloquently talked about the fact that the injection is not the Holy Grail. It's not the only option that we have. But I'll be honest with you, as a man who had the injection, this time last week, and danced down the street feeling life was changed for forever, there is again a perception amongst those in Europe that the vaccine is the be all and end all. And the big question that then comes into place is, in the traveller, in their minds, do they have a concern about travelling to Africa because they might give COVID-19 to Africans? Or is there a greater concern that when they travel to Africa, they might catch it? And again, at an individual level, I think there are going to be more who fall into the category of concern that they might catch it than pass it on. And certainly what we've seen within the ongoing consumer research that we've done month in, month out, is that within the panel of consumers that we've monitored, their growing emphasis on the vaccine has been huge. Whereas we were back in December, people were talking about 75% of them didn't want to go on a game drive unless everyone was wearing a face mask. Now that's suddenly disappeared. They're not worried about that in the slightest. Why? Because they've had their injection, or they will have had their injection by the time they travel. So again, they're not worried. It's this simple, basic level of perception where the communication is missing. And then the key ingredient that you guys have got to play with is the fact that somehow Africa has fared way, way better than we expected, and way better than here in the UK, in Germany, in France, in Spain, or wherever. Well, what's been the reason for that? In simple terms, communicate that to us, because actually you've got an opportunity to change the entire perception of health in Africa, not just your ability to deal with a pandemic that hit us incredibly hard, and yet you've dealt with it a whole heap better. So communicate that, and you've got a double whammy effect. So I think that, you know, perceptions are so important, and the communication of simple, easy to understand elements should be there. And just for what it's worth, the South African variant in my book is COVID-20, and the Kent version is COVID-21. That's about as complicated as I can deal with, because I can remember those things. So
20 and 21. I don't know if Alex would agree with you. Alex, over to you.
Well, actually, that's actually a point I wanted to agree on, because I've raised it with the scientists, that the problem is that the nomenclature that they've created makes people default back to a simple country name, anything they can kind of get their head around. So people get their head around the South African variant or the UK variant or the Brazil variant, but they don't get 501YV, 50 this, et cetera, and there are actually different nomenclatures for the same variant. And it's actually a mess from a communication perspective, and it's wrong that this information is presented in this particular way. So one of the things that I did want to suggest, because it is important from a communication perspective, is that a more neutral but understandable name is actually argued for by the parties that are going to be most affected by prejudice that is developed around the nomenclature. So a simpler, easy to understand that journalists can pick up on and use is actually important. Because in fact, we're going to be dealing with thousands of variants down the line. It's actually, it's only because people started through the genomic analysis to identify variants that people even got to know that variants actually exist, but they exist all the time and they're constantly mutating. But the other issue I wanted to mention is that, in fact, South Africa has been hit quite hard. But the question is, when people assess risk, and Africa, so Africa's risk has not been, Africa's impact of COVID has not been properly assessed because their collection of information and reporting is really poor. And in South Africa, so for instance, the error we're picking up in deaths in South Africa is by a factor of 3. So 150,000 potential deaths versus 50,000 reported. And our 50,000 reported will be a better report than for most of the rest of Africa. But the question is, what does that imply in terms of the risk to you or to another country? The issue is translating that, because I think that if I'm a traveler, I'm assessing my risk of being infected in another environment. And I'm worried if I think that I can't manage my own risk effectively. So I'm not necessarily dependent on a general perception or a government communication on risk. I'm more concerned about whether somebody can tell me whether or not I'm able to protect myself in that environment, and how risky is that particular virus to me, even though I've been vaccinated. So there's a further issue, and that is that the UK rolled out predominantly with AstraZeneca, and AstraZeneca in South Africa was found to be less effective against the South African variant. Now that's immediately going to be an issue that has to be managed. And we still don't know whether, so it's potentially the case that AstraZeneca doesn't protect against transmission, although it does protect you against the wild type virus, but not necessarily the domestic variant. So the question is, how do you now assess that from a risk perspective? The risk of severe illness is currently under examination. The recent data from AstraZeneca, who themselves clearly need a better PR manager, are showing that they had 100% effectiveness against severe illness. That's a really important result. That is more important than the efficacy of being infected. But being infected means you can transmit. So you're part of creating a wave, for instance, but you yourself will not get severely ill. Now, we don't have enough information yet, and I think the UK rollout is going to provide important information on the impact on the variant that we've got in South Africa, because the South African variant has been found in the UK, which means that they will have evidence on its potential impact, even though it's not in a trial setting. And then much of Europe is in the same position. Nobody's preventing any of these variants getting into their countries. They're going to get in no matter what they do. So but I think that the issue is, if somebody's been vaccinated with one particular vaccine, they go to an area like Brazil and they think, well, you know, apparently it won't work against that and it kills you more effectively there. We're worried. And I think that that means that one has to have a very close relationship to the science. And I don't think there's any getting around that, which means being able to communicate as accurately as possible what's going on, so that people are able to understand the risk they're facing, whatever the message that is. Because if I'm properly informed, I can manage my risk, I can understand what I'm doing. But if I feel people are lying to me, then I'm going to be cautious. And then on the issue of countries acting in a particular way, I think it's very interesting to watch how the different countries in Europe responded to the potential blood clots from the AstraZeneca vaccine rollouts, is that they immediately put a halt on their programs, despite the fact that many scientists said it's very unlikely that there's a causal relationship. But politically, they're not in a position to err on the side of incaution. So politically, they have to show themselves to be cautious. And that's going to be the government message always. They're going to err on the side of caution no matter what, until they are in a position where they are politically covered for the risks that are being identified out of the evidence. And that's where I say, again, the proximity of the evidence to government messaging, proximity of the evidence to individuals working out their own risk is very important. And therefore, it suggests a much faster turnaround of scientific information into messaging.
Absolutely.
To keep it correct.
Anita, you unmuted yourself, so I'll let you go quickly and then we'll hand over to Mon.
Absolutely. And I just want to firstly, Natalia, congratulate you and Africa Travel Week for having this conversation, because you're bringing up so many different aspects that are really critical. Two really quick things I just want to call out, and it's one of the reasons why we at the UNWTO have been working with the WHO from the beginning. Back in January, Dr. Van Kerkhove, who's the technical lead at the WHO, said in January, there needs to be a standard nomenclature for the different variants based on genetic sequence. And she went on to say, we would like this nomenclature to be easily understood, exactly to the point of Alex, and not include country names because we want to remove any geopolitical issues. That was stated right up front. And that's where it goes to what Tim and Shafiwa said about the fact that it's how we have articulated it. In full disclosure, my clients are CNN International, and it's not, and they're always being hammered about points of view on Africa and this and that. There will always be negative news. There will always be storylines, but what are we doing to correct that? What are we doing to neutralize it, to re-articulate that? Because even when we talk about concern and risk of travelers, this is what is fascinating. IATA did some research recently. Over 80% of people, why are they fearful of travel? It's not because of capturing COVID-19. It's because of something happening with COVID, that borders close, quarantines are imposed, and they're stuck somewhere. At the height of the pandemic, 16,000 aircraft were grounded, 6 million people were displaced. The fear is not necessarily the virus. The fear is that any risk of the virus being non-contained is going to shut borders and ground people again and put them back into quarantine. Just to be clear about the definition of what risk is.
Yeah, that is actually a fantastic point. Monica, over to you. We're talking communication, and I loved Alex saying science. Alex, you're singing off my hymn sheet. I want lots of science in our communications, but I'm kind of wondering if they believe us these days. Mon, tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing.
Thanks, and hello everyone. Apologies for the audio. I am at the Vineyard Hotel, so if there's happy waiters downstairs having a conversation, I do apologize. The first thing that I think we've all missed, and maybe it's because we've kind of, we're trying to ignore the reality, but tonight at midnight is the 1-year lockdown anniversary for South Africa, which I just thought I'd kind of mention here. It's not a happy day, but I just thought it was quite auspicious to have this conversation today, of all days. And then second of all, I wanted to just say, agree with what everybody's been saying with regards to the communication around this. Bina was saying in the chat, and I think this is the ultimate reality, is that we're laboring under a very historic, very long-standing, and probably very long project around Afro-pessimism. And we've experienced it in the Cape around day zero. We've experienced it around Ebola. We've experienced it around, you know, the unabridged birth certificate crisis that we had in South Africa. Whenever something goes wrong, it feels like it's just an affirmation of the global perception around this Afro-pessimism. So I think that there's a big job to be done. 501YV2 is just the current sharp edge of the wedge, but I don't know that it is the ultimate solution. Having said that, Natalia and the team at Wesgro have been working together with also some of our Wesgro stakeholders and also with National to try and build some narrative around the real South African variant. So the Wesgro guys have said, so the real South African variant is actually the Rooibos tea versus the Earl Grey. And the real South African variant is actually the Pinotage wine rather than etc. But we've also built what we're busy doing at the moment, and Natalia, you can speak to that a little bit more intelligibly than me. We're building a white label website, which is going to provide Q&A, assets, information for the trade, because obviously we are at the coalface when it comes to insecurities of travelers, questions around what is this variant, can I travel, can't I travel, borders opening, borders closing, what are quarantine requirements, all of those sorts of things. So we're busy building a website, which Nat, I think you can share probably in a couple of days, I'm hoping. I saw a mock-up today and it's looking really good, which Wesgro is obviously working in the background and assisting with narrative and with information, and obviously the entire country really is getting mobilized. And then there's an additional ask. We need as an industry and as a nation in South Africa, we need to join forces, and we need to be clear around the fact that it is not the South African variant, and we should check ourselves every single time we say South African variant. We all got very shocked when Trump stood up and called it the Chinese virus. And yet now we are very comfortable in assigning geographical locations to variants, which has essentially the same effect. And so I want to kind of really encourage all of us, certainly in the South African context, it's called 501YB2. It's not that hard. We can call it that. Or you can, as Alex correctly said just now, it is the variant that has been found in South Africa, if you'd like. But we're also building op-ed stories. So we're creating some opinion pieces which we're seeding in native PR internationally as well as locally, to kind of tell the story that Chief also mentioned earlier. Our scientists were actually good enough and strong enough to actually do genomic sequencing long before many other so-called first world countries even started doing it. So we were actually the cool kids on the block to having found this variant, and have actually, which I think also the guys came out in a press release a couple of days ago, it's now informing design of vaccines going forward. So the learnings that we've had out of this discovery that we had in South Africa is actually a great news story, and not something that the tourism industry in South Africa should be beat about the head with.
Yeah, and I think that's, that's probably something we need to have a chat. Alex, you're just going to have to come into the tourism industry and forget about doing anything else, I'm afraid. Sorry for you. But getting scientists, the medical community, the scientific community globally acknowledging that, because it's one thing we're saying it as a tourism industry, it's one thing having our scientific community saying it, but it's a little bit like marking your own homework. When you get Dr. I think his name is Sanjay Gupta on CNN saying, look how well South Africa has handled the pandemic. Somehow it has more credibility. It sounds terrible, but it has more credibility because it's someone from outside who's commenting on how we are handling the pandemic, and it is more believable. How do we get more people outside of the country, instead of just looking at us trying to say this, to talk positively about that? So I'm going to ask Anita first. She's unmuted herself, and then Chief.
Right. I think just to quickly answer that, and thank you for calling out the work that Dr. Gupta had done alongside Anderson Cooper. A lot of it is really important around, it's the message versus the messenger. We on the inside of the tourism industry, it's always going to feel as if the message is slightly twisted because we have a vested interest. But leaders around the world, the CNN Internationals, the Chatham Houses, the Bill Gates Foundations, these people who are completely agnostic to any political or commercial gain, those are the voices people need to hear, and those are the voices people need to trust. And that's where, and you used the word right up front, Natalia, which was correct about, we can't be victims about this. Banging on the door and jesting about it and using it doesn't help the situation. And it goes exactly what was talked about by Monica about Afro-pessimism. This is not about an issue about the reputation of the continent and the country because of COVID-19. This has been an ongoing issue around the continent for years, whether we're talking about Ebola, election riots, the water crisis, whatever. We have to own the narrative, but owning the narrative in a way that can package it in a simple way to get people to understand the correct way of articulating it, and doing it in a way that is digestible. The science has been absolutely vital to get people to, across the world, understand the messages. We then need to translate those, but get the right messengers that people trust, that do not have a vested interest. And recognizing, and that's where we go back to what was fantastic, was to see how the world celebrated how His Excellency President Ramaphosa responded right up front. It was quick, it was unilateral, the country had to shut down. Everyone was doing the best that they could. And we've seen countries around the world that have been divided up politically, by state, by region, because they're debating the politics over the science. We need the science, but exactly as you say, we need to articulate it in a way where everyone can understand, this is what's happening. What do you need me to do about it to be able to now shift to a solution where we can all walk out safely and confidently?
That's a really great point. Message and messenger. Chief, you're on.
Look, we're going to have to reach out to, various countries, that have, pretty much banned their own people to come to our country and ourselves to go to their country, or impose this strict, quarantine and so forth and so on. We're going to have to reach out. Us as the tourism sector, as the army of tourism, we know exactly what this means. And we know that, we can galvanize, we can get the ground forces to go out there and communicate. But without the scientific evidence coming from the scientists from those particular countries, talking on behalf of ourselves, so to speak, and really putting it into perspective in those countries, especially, to sway the politicians and the regulators, decision makers in those particular countries to see things differently, is going to be an uphill battle. So we are now entering into a situation where even if there's vaccination, like one of the speakers said, they're still going to say, well, as much as you are a UK citizen, you've been vaccinated, you can't go to South Africa because that variant is unknown. And you may get sick. So we're gonna have to, one, communicate from what we have in South Africa, what type of facilities we have, how we're gonna handle someone who comes into the country, how they can go through our medical expertise and so forth and so on. Number two, we're gonna talk to the people out there, the scientists that are in the UK, Germany, and everywhere else. They need to look at this situation and tell us exactly what would happen if the travelers from those countries come to South Africa. And if the situation is positive, then it's more believable in those countries. But I'm afraid that with us being a country in Africa and the fact that we have so many things that are better than many first world countries, including our human capital, there is still the perception that they are in Africa. And therefore, there's been so many diseases and many other things that they've gone through and they cannot be trusted. So we're going to have to go out there, get the scientists in the US, get the scientists in the UK, Germany, China, everywhere else, so that they can look at this thing from a scientific point of view. And if we can get that done and start to change the narrative, then we'll be moving somewhere. But I'm afraid it's going to be an uphill battle. We're still going to have a long 6 months, even if we talk to the diplomats, even if we go through DECO or whoever, it's still a dialogue. It's not a factual thing that can be put in the public of those countries so that when they consider traveling, they consider South Africa. So we're preparing now for the next level of battle to make sure that, we regain some level of market share from these countries that used to be our source markets or the new countries that are going to be our source markets. And it's going to take a collective effort from all of us, from the tourism family, to be the army that defend tourism, and also to talk to those that are in the scientific community, both here at home and in other countries across Africa and also overseas, so that a message that is scientifically investigated can be put out so that people can then consider traveling, based on the facts in front of them.
Tim, I'm going to go over to you and just segue from what Chief was talking about. Bino posted in the chat about any data on how Kenya and Rwanda have fared after their more friendly restrictions. We look at countries like Tanzania, Kenya, who my understanding is East Africa has actually been very popular in the source markets. And I always thought, Africa is one country. People overseas see Africa as one country. Surely if there's this scary thing happening in South Africa, that the rest of Africa would get tainted. But at the same time, I'm hearing tour operators say that there's huge demand for East Africa. Can you give us an idea of what the reputation is like for destinations like Kenya and Rwanda in the UK, for example, based on the friendlier environment, if you will, or that reputation?
Yeah, sure. I think there are a number of contradictions that very definitely exist. Again, in what we've seen from the destinations, well, I'm rambling. The first start point is from a consumer perspective, 50% of them have seen no positive editorial, social media, advertising, or any communication of any sort about any African destination. 51% have said they've seen nothing. And the highest, and you'll be pleased to know, is for South Africa, is at 26%. Okay, Rwanda, 0. Okay, that's which I find totally unbelievable. And I've been rereading the data, and it's slowly but surely gone down and down. And one of the things I have seen is that Rwanda as a destination amongst the UK, in terms of its popularity and the desire to actually go there, has continued to tumble for the last 18 months. Again, I think that the tour operators will bear out whether the sales figures actually contradict that. But from a UK consumer perspective, Rwanda has not increased in its popularity. So I do believe there's a major contradiction in there somewhere. In terms of its desirability, I'm just taking a quick look at the data I've been looking at only this morning. Yeah, Rwanda's down at 15% of consumers would actually want to go there, and that was over 30% pre-pandemic. Compare that with Tanzania at 43, South Africa at 47, Botswana 49, and it's shocking that Rwanda's right down there. So I think that somebody somewhere has got the wrong data, and if it's me, I'll put my hands up. But we've been following this data for the last 6 months, consistently seeing the results come in. What we have seen, the feedback from tour operators, is that the traditional markets from the UK of Kenya, Tanzania, and South Africa have remained relatively positive. The secondary destinations, the Ugandas, the Rwandas, the Ethiopias, have been hit a little bit harder. They seem to have dropped off the list. But for me, one of the ones I find quite curious is how popular Madagascar is becoming over this period, and yet it, from a health perspective, has had quite a number of supposed scares in the last few years. You know, the plague was apparently on the island, which, hey, that, you know, if you want something to scare the living daylights out of consumers, the chance of getting the plague is normally something that's pretty off-putting. Yeah, consumers are just not even interested in it, and Madagascar continues to grow in its relative importance. So I think that people's desire to travel to certain destinations does not appear to have any direct correlation versus other African destinations on COVID-19. So it seems to be bigger issues or different issues that come into play.
Interesting. Thanks, Tim. Anita?
Sorry, just a quick one on that as well, because I think, and again, reflecting now on both the UN side, but also CNN International, what's really important about this whole pandemic, we've all been grounded for 14 months. We are travelers. And the travelers of the future, the value of travel has changed and the values of travel have changed. Importantly, it's motivations. It's not about when the world opens up again, where am I going to go on holiday? All of us on the screen, all of us watching, have been apart from our families. We've missed birthdays, anniversaries, funerals, memorials. Heart is going to be the motivation before holiday. That's really important. So it's not about where do I want to go on my holiday? Who have I missed most and what do I want to be connected with, having been disconnected for the last 14 months? To your point, Tim, about Madagascar, we're seeing island destinations as a whole are growing. Why? Because psychologically they're bubbles. They are contained areas like cruise ships are becoming, all-inclusive hotels and resorts. People have been told to keep with only certain people, only certain family members, stay in your bubbles. That bubble mentality is going to shift into how people travel in the next normal. And then there'll be a next normal after that. But in the immediate term, it's not the traditional metrics of how we measure destination success. Also, it's not even about the destination attractiveness. Is there airlift to get our source markets to where they want to go? So a lot of destinations have been very smart. Greece was amazing with their whole Greek summer campaign last year. And countries are saying, you might not be able to come here now, but we've missed you. And when you can travel, we want you back. Part of the narrative of the future of rebuilding travel is getting the invitation out now. So as people are choosing what's next on their, not bucket list, but to-do list, they're going to go to South Africa next. They're going to go to Rwanda next. We need to start that interest now. But the realities are motivations are different and mobility is highly constrained.
Heart more than holiday. Absolutely love that. Mon, if I could just go over to you, we're going to end off heart more than holiday. We have to get our travel industry to align and to communicate that heart over holiday. I think to our existing customer base, we need to remind them how much they miss South Africa. It's much easier to remind people who've been to South Africa and get them to advocate on our behalf than going out to a new audience. How can we do that as an industry? Get aligned and start speaking as one community. We have massive networks as an industry.
So I think, Natalia, you've done excellent work with that already. I think Westgrow's just really been supporting in the wings. So you've corralled a whole team of private tourism, private sector marketing gurus that have all committed to collaborating and putting the same message out to all of their channels. I think the invitation of, say, call it by its name, is I think one that we're extending to all of our industry colleagues globally. We want to encourage people to stick to the facts, and we want to provide the facts in a very objective and very scientific way. As you say, the bad news and the good news very transparently. And then we want to provide our partners internationally as well as domestically, who've got much bigger reach, really, let's face it, than just you or I individually, to support us in singing off the same hymn sheet. But I really do want you to tell us all a little bit more about this asset that we're building together. Please.
So yes, so we've created a website called visitsouthafrica.info, and it is a website that has some of the health information on it. Alex, I might lean on you a little bit to give me some advice on where I can get some up-to-date stuff on a constant basis so that we can keep that populated. It's got an FAQ on it based on all the questions that our industry partners have asked us to get answers to, and that's everything from what does the vaccine program rollout look like to is PCR testing widely available in South Africa? And if so, where is it? You know, just like what addresses, where can I get the PCR test? So this is a trade resource. Very importantly, it is brand agnostic. It does not belong to anyone. It doesn't belong to Wesgro. It doesn't belong to me. It doesn't belong to the TVCSA. It belongs to nobody. This is an industry resource for anybody who works in the tourism industry that sells South Africa specifically. And we will update it on an ongoing basis so that you can go in, copy what you need, and make sure, to Chief's point, that you are communicating the same thing to your customers on an ongoing basis. And we will commit to keeping that website up to date for you. So that will be launched in the coming days. Thanks, Mon, for that. And also just an acknowledgement to Judy Lane, who came up with the Call It By Its Name, because I think that that's really great. Call It By Its Name. We've reached out to DMOs around the world, because today it's South Africa and Brazil and Kent. Tomorrow it could be Japan and Germany and somewhere else. So we as DMOs all need to be standing together to make sure that we are calling it by its name. I want to thank Africa Travel Week for coming up with the topic, putting this together. Thank you so much for allowing us the opportunity to reconnect. And to my amazing panelists, can we be on for another half an hour, please? You have been absolutely fantastic. Tim, Alex, Anita, Monica, Chief, have a wonderful weekend. You've deserved it. Thank you so much for your service, all of you, to our industry. We could not do this without you. We are incredibly grateful to you. And thank you to all of you for attending today. Remember to register for Africa Travel Week. There's an amazing content program of like 50 talks, panel discussions, and presentations. Everything from domestic tourism to travel tech. I'm so thrilled that it's such a fantastic program, and I know you'll enjoy it.